Associate Professor Jamus Lim. Sorry. Hang on a second. Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the proceedings on the business set down on the order paper for today be exempted at this day's sitting from the provisions of Standing Order Number 2.
The question is that the motion moved by leader, as many as are of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Associate Professor Jamus Lim.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this debate. As a representative of a constituency with a comparatively younger demographic, many of whom are parents of young children, and as a father of a young daughter myself, I have a deep, enduring interest in the implications of climate change for the next generation. This is precisely why we should regard this issue as a climate emergency, not so much because of the specific challenges that we face today, but in terms of what we leave behind for our children tomorrow, who will bear the costs of any impending environmental disaster. I wish to commiserate with this House about the importance of a well-functioning carbon tax system for delivering effective reductions in our nation's carbon footprint. Importantly, I will argue in favor of such a tax relative to other seemingly more efficient systems, such as cap and trade. But I will also suggest reasons why the current system as it stands is inadequate, as well as propose some practical refinements to the existing regime. To be clear, there is an existing carbon tax stipulated in the Carbon Pricing Act of 2018, which came into force on January 2019. This was an important first step. As Lao Tzu reminds us, 千里之行，始于足下. Commonly translated as a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But it is only a first step, and unfortunately this step has been too tentative. The current rate is set at $5 per metric ton of greenhouse gas emissions, set to be increased to $10 to $15 a ton by 2030. This figure falls far below recommended amounts by just about every credible source. The median estimate called for by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is $95. Systematic reviews of academic estimates suggest a price closer to $77. Our rate is even low compared to actual rates currently imposed worldwide. The OECD's calculations indicate that the effective rate among 41 major economies amounts to $65. And all these numbers are in US dollars, not even local currency. Moreover, the existing carbon tax is limited just to the largest industrial facilities, those emitting in excess of 2,000 tons of CO2, and effectively covers just about 30 to 40 companies. Not only would this excessively conservative target fail to generate the sort of volume reductions required, it also concentrates the tax burden on a small set of firms. Even if these firms do account for the vast majority of emissions, the narrow coverage is inconsistent with public finance principles. It is worth noting that there are attractive alternatives to the carbon tax, a cap and trade system. As the name implies, cap and trade caps the total amount of emissions according to some target, before subsequently allowing the trading of each firm's allocated emissions amount. The idea behind this is straightforward. Firms that are better at reducing their carbon footprint stand to gain by selling their share to other, less efficient firms. Meanwhile, those with less carbon reduction capacity can obtain reprieve by purchasing offset from these more efficient firms. In theory, it is possible to arrive at the same final outcome of reductions in environmentally harmful emissions with either carbon taxes or cap and trade. But there are a number of reasons to favor taxes as a preferred instrument. The carbon tax is more robust to uncertainty. Cap and trade systems, while offering greater clarity over the ultimate amount of emissions that would result, tend to fall prey to uncertainty in terms of compliance costs. In a post-recession economic climate, where uncertainty over impending costs is especially pernicious for the functioning of business, it makes more sense to allow uncertainty to fall on the total emissions front. Furthermore, carbon taxes are less likely to be gained by participants. The experience of countries that have sought to introduce quantity restrictions on pollutants is that they are difficult to ensure compliance. Cap and trade also encourages front-loading of investment in dirty technologies, since those with greater polluting potential are more likely to be granted higher initial caps. And even after implementation, permit trading can ironically encourage more pollution than otherwise, as firms trade off gains in market share against environmental penalties. In comparison, a carbon tax, based as it is on the price mechanism, is straightforward, easily observed and monitored, and hence more likely to be enforced successfully. Another principle of public finance has to do with whom the rents from the imposition of a tax or a quota accrues. Because taxes are directly collected from the government, taxes generate revenue that flow directly into the public fisc. In contrast, if permits are simply assigned to firms, firms will capture the quota rents. This is not simply a theoretical matter. It also carries enormous practical implications. Although the end objective, a reduction in total emissions, may be equivalently achieved via either method, carbon taxes raised can be directed toward other important social objective. If instead quota permits are either simply issued or sold at an inappropriate discount to corporations, there is no guarantee that the excess value will subsequently be redirected toward the most optimal societal needs. Mr. Speaker, a properly calibrated carbon tax also offers a more decisive push toward climate-friendly structural reforms of our domestic economy. At the moment, our energy and fuel sources, not to mention our export basket, remains heavily inflected toward fossil fuels. For instance, in late October 2020, the government announced that it will import electricity from Malaysia under a 2-year trial. I accept that part of the underlying premise for the effort is to spur a regional green electricity market. Even so, the contours of the deal, as reported by the press, strike me as incomplete. After all, energy is fungible. If Malaysia sells us clean energy only to undo our emissions gains, with producing more dirty energy elsewhere, the planet will suffer as net emissions increase. The deal is also symptomatic of how we tend to postpone the difficult act of passing costs through to the end consumer, some of which would ultimately be necessary to institute a behavioral shift toward a greater reliance on non-renewables. As another example, the number of hybrid and electric vehicles in Singapore remain tiny. About 1,400 electric vehicles and 52,000 hybrids out of our 950,000 strong fleet, a mere 6%. While Minister Heng did announce last year that internal combustion engine vehicles would be phased out by 2040, and Minister Ong has stated that we could be more ambitious in our move to low emissions vehicles, it is difficult to envision this occurring without a clearer commitment, at least in the medium run, toward carbon taxes applied to petrol as well as diesel. The petrochemicals industry currently contributes a non-trivial share to Singapore's national output, around 81 billion or 3%, and our nation is currently the world's 7th largest exporter of chemicals and industry. What have we done to reduce the sector's footprint on our local economy and to transition toward more climate-friendly production? In this regard, it's worth noting that China despite its relatively lower per capita income, has recognized the enormous potential that green technology offers and has embraced it in earnest. It has, in doing so, taken an important lead in developing such technologies. While we may not have certain built-in advantages in every dimension of green tech, we could find comparative advantage in certain niche areas, as my colleague, the member from Aljunied, Leon Pereira, will share in his speech. A higher carbon tax applied more broadly across the economy will help usher in the necessary shifts by embedding the costs of carbon emissions directly into input prices. It also ensures that all segments of society, business, workers, government, and civil society internalize the costs and consequences of climate change. So how should we move forward? Mr. Speaker, I've made the case that the carbon tax, even the upper limit of $15 suggested by the CPA for 2030, is too low. If we wish to proceed carefully, we run the risk of our efforts being wholly unproductive altogether if we remain excessively cautious. In such a case, we end up with the worst of both worlds. We introduce a friction on business operation, but we fail to gain the benefits of effective climate change mitigation. Well, the specific price is certainly up for debate and should ideally be deliberated by a panel of experts with representatives from business, environmental civil society groups, policymakers from the NEA and MSC, and academics. A starting point of around $58 would at least place Singapore at the midpoint among industrialized economies, even if it remains below what would be necessary for decisive climate change mitigation. Another useful benchmark is $133, which is the average cost of carbon capture and sequestration activities. A figure within this range would be a very useful start for the panel and our civil service to deliberate. And if I may turn the question around, posed by Minister Fu, how did the government arrive at $15? Was this based on the latest credible scientific evidence of the amount that would be necessary for Singapore to achieve its climate change goals? I would also suggest significantly expanding the coverage of the tax. The government has already accepted that there should be no exemptions to firms liable for the tax. Yet it has chosen to limit the scope to the 30 or so major emitters. This runs against a standard principle of public finance that taxes should, ideally, be small and broad to minimize the distortionary effects. Moreover, there's little reason to retain the existing uniform tax across sectors. The firms currently affected by the tax are in distinct industries, petroleum, chemical, semiconductors, and should the scope of coverage be further expanded, they would include firms in even more disparate sectors. Accordingly, sector-specific taxes would offer more room to ensure that targets are met, given the varied propensity for emissions in different industries. Perhaps most crucially, the revenues from our carbon tax can be used to offset other taxes, to ease the transition and to ensure progressivity. Such tax-for-tax offsets, which we may call raise and rebate, are not unprecedented and have been exercised by the government in the past. The government can do the same this time as a green dividend. Alternatively, carbon taxes can be directed toward a green fund to be used toward investments that would further advance environmental objectives, such as solar panels or recycling operations, that serve to decarbonize the economy. My colleague, member for Aljunied Jarugyam, has developed these ideas in greater detail in his speech. The bottom line is that we can ensure that the tax is revenue neutral, which can go a long way toward mitigating the negative effects of higher costs and focus instead on shifting the structure of our economy. Mr. Speaker, I'm aware that I find myself in the somewhat unusual circumstance of defending the merits of an existing government program against an alternative that has been proposed by, among others, the PAP Youth Wing, which sit on the opposite side of the aisle. That said, other members, such as Mr. Don Wee and Mr. Henry Quack, have made the case for retaining a carbon tax, albeit with differing details. I attribute it to the shared rarefied air that we have all the way up here. That said, I have taken this position because I believe that that the carbon tax is not only credible, but it also embeds preferable distributional outcomes relative to schemes that may be more attractive from an efficiency standpoint on paper, but ultimately fall short in real-world conditions. Perhaps ironically, economists have moved toward this new consensus position despite being the ones to initially champion the cap-and-trade system. This shift occurred after increasing evidence emerged in favor of a tax relative to cap-and-trade. And when the facts change, we should be willing to change our minds. Singapore has the fortune of already being a technologically advanced, services-oriented economy, and hence inherently better positioned to embrace more decisive moves toward addressing environmental issues and, in particular, the threat of climate change. Climate change is an emergency, which calls for drastic measures. We should not allow this opportunity to pass, victim to a lackadaisical policy position and undue timidity. Perhaps just as importantly, we cannot relinquish our chance to be global leaders by our signal of how a decisive move away from business as usual is truly a moral imperative. With that parting thought, I express my support for the motion as amended by the member from Hougang, Mr. Dennis Tan.